Today's video is sponsored by Readly, of whom more in a bit. When we think of the space race, I think we tend to think of it as a US-Soviet thing. The Soviets got an early head start, the Americans got to the moon, and then everyone sort of got bored with it. What's less well known is that in the early days, Britain also considered itself a contender. And that's why I'm here on the Isle of Wight. We're going to take a look at some of the remains of Britain's space programme at high down. The Second World War had changed Britain. It went into the war as a major world power with an empire to back it up. It came out with a housing shortage, rationing, and an austerity economy only kept afloat by loans from the USA. The sun was finally setting on the British Empire. But Britain was still a nation of technological innovation. There was a sense that if they no longer had the brawn, at least they still had the brain. And so, in 1955, Britain gained the beginnings of a space programme. Behind the optimistic concept of slipping the surly bonds of Earth and touching the stars, etc., was a much more sinister reasoning. The end of the Second World War led to the beginning of the Cold War. The development of atomic weapons, showcased with devastating effect at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, led to a new arms race. Initially, atomic weapons were delivered in the form of bombs, but it was soon clear that the future lay in missiles. Britain, being stuck between the US and the USSR, was determined not to be left behind. And that was the true purpose of the rocket program: to develop ballistic missiles. Now, Britain already had something of a history with rockets, a century and a half, in fact. The basic concept of rocket artillery had been copied from the Kingdom of Mysore, who had used rockets against the British East India Company's army during the Anglo-Mysorean Wars of the 1780s and 90s. William Congreve developed a British version at the Royal Arsenal in the first decade of the 19th century. These rockets, which were inevitably nicknamed Congreves, were not especially accurate at long range, but were useful for anything where you had a large target that you wanted to set on fire. A sailing ship, say. During the Second World War, Germany had made huge leaps forward in rocketry, with the development of the terrifying V-1 and V-2 missile. These represented the future of warfare, and other nations took note. Following the war, they scrambled to develop their own rocket programs, in some cases even using the same German scientists. On that somewhat ominous note, I'm going to take a break for a couple of minutes to talk about this video's sponsor, Readly. Now, as you may have gathered from past videos, I'm a big fan of Readly. If you're travelling, whether into space or just down to the shops, Readly is a great investment. It's a magazine reading app which gives you access to literally thousands of magazines and newspapers on all sorts of subjects and in many languages. There's even back issues if you find a title you really like and you want more. Catch up on the news from Earth, read up on your interests, or even learn something new. For instance, here I'm learning about the planets. If you're looking to save money, say if you've just spent millions on a rocket launch, a single very reasonable monthly fee will give you unlimited access to all these titles. No more taking up valuable payload space with stacks of magazines. Everything's accessible with a couple of clicks on whatever device you like. Personally, I have the app on my phone so I can whip out a magazine anytime I find myself with time to kill. Say, waiting for a bus or waiting for a countdown to complete. And I know what you aspiring astronauts are thinking. That's all very well, but what if I don't have internet access in space? Well, Readly allows you to download magazines so you can read them offline. Each Readly account can be shared with up to 5 people, perfect for if you should happen to make first contact with friendly aliens while you're up there. Or if the aliens are unfriendly, you can throw your phone at them and continue to browse using a friend's device. But here's the mission-critical bit for all you space cadets. If you sign up using my exclusive link in the description below, you can get 2 months completely free. That's absolutely fantastic. In fact, you might say it's something insert space pun here. Readly, because sometimes you just need a break from exploring strange new worlds. Britain's main launch site was actually in Australia at Woomera, but most of the development work would be carried out in Britain. So really what was needed was a test range that was actually in the UK. It would be terribly embarrassing to ship everything halfway around the world only to discover that some crucial error had been made. High Down on the Isle of Wight was considered to be as close as Britain could get to the conditions at Woomera. It also had the advantage of being far from population centres. It's a short distance up the coast from the popular attractions of Alum Bay and the Needles, but the layout of the coastline meant that the secret base would not be visible from there. It also housed a disused coastal battery which would give the military a head start on the construction work needed. The site was established in 1956 and completed the following year. It covered an area of 35 acres. Much of the facility recycled buildings constructed for the coastal battery, turning old storerooms and magazines into laboratories and workshops. Vast tanks for rocket fuel, an electrical substation, and even a water reservoir were built. Of course, there were firefighters, because on a rocket base it's basically guaranteed that something's going to catch fire when it shouldn't. There were other support services, such as a barracks and a canteen. And, as you might expect for a secret base, there was a police post to prevent any hikers, or people claiming to be hikers, from wandering in. Neither Dan Dare nor Professor Quatermass are recorded as having ever been present, but then it was a secret base. The actual rocket test site was not for the launching of rockets. Apart from anything else, it would be rather difficult to get them back from the middle of the sea. Rather, the rockets were held in place on gantries, which would also provide support equipment. Fuel lines, maintenance platforms, firefighting hoses, and hoists. The weather here could be, to put it lightly, inclement, so the gantries were also important for making sure that the rockets, didn't get blown off the cliff or anything. Each gantry was approximately 62 feet tall, or 19 metres, and the base was 20 feet by 16 feet, or 6 metres by 4.9 metres. An awful lot of different organisations were involved in the rocket programme. The main government organisations were the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment. Then there were a number of commercial enterprises. Bristol Siddeley were in charge of the engines. Saunders Roe dealt with overall design and construction. And they also had a factory on the Isle of Wight at East Cowes. De Havilland Propellers Limited provided expert personnel for Woomera. At High Down, the different components would be brought together for comprehensive testing. An early success was the Black Knight rocket. The first test at High Down was carried out in April 1957, 3 months after the base's completion. The aim of this was to get up into orbit, then launch different types of head back into the atmosphere, to see which was best suited for re-entry. As you might have guessed, the ultimate aim was to launch warheads, but also decoys to make defence against missiles more difficult. The rockets were propelled by a mix of kerosene and hydrogen peroxide, which was somewhat easier to control than, for instance, liquid oxygen. This fuel mix generated huge clouds of steam, which must have mystified tourists at Alum Bay. The Black Knight proved to be a great success with 0 failures. Somewhat less successful was the Blue Streak, Britain's first attempt at an intermediate-range ballistic missile. The engines were tested at High Down, and development of the missile was completed in 1957, but it had its flaws. Most obviously, it was very expensive. It was also considered vulnerable to a surprise attack, and development had been slow. In 1960 the programme was cancelled. However, the actual rocket part of it was, to use a technical term, pretty decent. The engines developed for the Black Knight and Blue Streak would ultimately lead to the Black Arrow, a rocket intended for civilian use. In 1971, the Black Arrow would successfully place the satellite Prospero in orbit. It was the British space programme's greatest victory, but it would prove to be a hollow victory. Prospero was released on the 28th of October, but on the 29th of July the Black Arrow programme had been cancelled. Rather than being celebrated as a triumph of British engineering, it was an embarrassment to the government of the day, although I do rather think they only have themselves to blame for that. Overall, the rocketry programme should be considered a success for what the engineering team were working with. The Black Knight and Black Arrow rockets were not showy vehicles. They were small vessels built on a low budget. They weren't massive propaganda pieces that would put men on the moon. Perhaps it was this lack of glamour that contributed to their unpopularity with the chaps in Westminster. But from an engineering standpoint, they were efficient, technologically sound, and well built, especially given the low budget their teams had for development and construction. For all their hard work and ingenuity, half the team behind the Black Arrow were made redundant with the cancellation of the programme. The final unused rocket would be put in the Science Museum in London, as a monument to the only nation to simultaneously succeed and fail at a satellite launch programme. From now on, the plan was that Britain would use American technology, both for defence and commercial space travel. Britain is still involved in space exploration, but as a relatively minor player. As for High Down, well, without a rocket programme, the British government didn't really need it anymore. Most of the equipment was removed and a lot of the old buildings were demolished. In 1971, the site was inherited by Saunders Roe, who, thanks to a lot of corporate mergers and reorganisations, were now part of the British Hovercraft Corporation, who had even less use for a rocket testing site. Despite trying to hire it out to other companies who might like an isolated scientific base, they eventually gave up. The site was closed in 1974 and sold to the National Trust in 1975. High Down is no longer a secret. In fact, it's now a tourist attraction. A memorial to Britain's attempt to be a contender in the space race. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon for your generous support. You are the hydrogen peroxide to my kerosene. Thanks also to Readly for sponsoring today's video. Click on the link in the description below to take advantage of their offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.